right, Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation. My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. But actually what we really do is we look at the world of geopolitics, and we have done nothing clearer this week and last week than speak about the situation in the Ukraine. And basically what I've done last week is just set out for you the question in part one: is the Ukraine worth dying for? Now maybe I could have articulated that better and explained that what I actually mean, and I will articulate it better in part two, is that what I want to say is it worth any Briton, particularly a civilian in the homeland, dying to continue a Ukraine war, which in the first instance was spurious anyway? I haven't gone deeply into the causes of the war pre the special military operation that I spoke to you last week about, and why President Putin and indeed the Russians thought they had to wage it. So I haven't gone into that in any detail because I did it some months ago, a little bit longer, well, years ago maybe. Years ago, actually, that's how long the war's been going on. But I've been asked to do a little bit just to explain, because people come out with, oh, you're using Russian talking points. I mean, that's the new terminology now for saying that you're explaining things that people don't want you to explain. So if we do a very, very, very quick potted history, and then I'm going to say something, or maybe I should say something before, which I will do, before we go into the potted history. Look, the reality of the situation is that you can very, very easily change people's minds about what has gone on in the world, historical events, by, whitewashing those events. I'll use that terminology. So, example, a survey was done shortly after the victory in the Second World War within Britain. And that survey basically asked, who won the Second World War? Which country played the primary role on winning the Second World War? In that survey, 70% of Britons said the Soviet Union. Uncle Joe in the Soviet Union was the primary body that won the Second World War. Okay, so that's in 1945/46. In 1959, I think it was, and you can get the survey up, you can look on the internet, the same question was asked. And that had dropped to something like 35% of the people said it was the Soviet Union. Then it was done again in the 1970s, and these are under different people doing it, the 1970s. And it was said Britain and America won the war. And it was something very high to 60-odd percent, 65%. And then in the 1990s, it was done again, and people said the United States were the primary people who won the Second World War, something like 80%. And we were there as well, Britain and the United States, right? So what I'm saying to you is that it took not that long, in fact 10 years, before people had been moved by the state, by the government, by Churchill's Iron Curtain, etc., to suggest that the Soviet Union didn't do the most to win the Second World War. Now, I'm going to add another element to this, just to give you some idea. And I think I've said it before, so I'll say it very, very quickly. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union lost between 27 million people. When I say lost, killed, died, dead, 27 million Soviets were killed. And we lost, in the United Kingdom, 450,000 killed. And when I'm saying that, it's civilians and military. Okay, civilians and military. Now, when you class the United Kingdom, as with the Soviet Union, you're not just talking Russians. And when you talk about the United Kingdom, you're not just talking Brits from the United Kingdom. When you talk about the United Kingdom, in those figures, we include all of the direct rule colonies. So that's your Caribbeans, your West and East Africans. And by the way, before in saying that, one should understand Hong Kong it includes. In saying that, one should understand that when we talk about West and East Africans, Caribbeans, Hong Kongs, these people did die not in small number. Okay, they weren't massive numbers because half the places aren't massive, but not in small number. And so what you've got to understand is that, they're a significant percentage, if you will, want to put it that way, a significant percentage of those numbers. And then when we come to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, which we think of, the countries which were part of the empire, but basically ran themselves. Again, we assume the losses are much higher when they're not, actually. We're looking at the Canadians. Losses were 44,000. Australia's losses were 39,000. New Zealand's losses were 12,000. South Africa's losses were 12,000. Okay? So, you start looking and you put 27 million against the losses we have in the United Kingdom. And as I said, the United Kingdom included colonies, which were clear colonies. And then we look at, China, which nobody ever talks about, which people say is between 20 and 30 million losses. In the Second World War. But we don't speak about them. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is, and this is the point that I've been making with this, is the point I'm going to make with the Ukraine, is you can very, very easily, purposefully wish to replace reality on who wins things. If you want to, I know it's quite a questionable position, but the Soviet army was the army which basically destroyed the German army. Okay, so basically put, 1 in every 7 losses of Germans were lost to the West. So in other words, 6 of every 7 losses for German soldiers were lost on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets. So contextualize that. And then you can truly say who won the war. Now, the other factor is, in terms of German losses, the German civilian losses, the vast majority of German civilian losses, and I know we hear all this about, Russians came in and killed everybody. No, the vast majority of German civilian losses, fact, look it up, okay, were losses caused by bombing from the West, the United Kingdom and the United States. And they were civilians, because our bombing was indiscriminate. And the reason why Bomber Command, which should have got its own statue years and years ago, because if you know, the pilots and the other airmen who took part in Bomber Command and the people who worked in the RAF throughout, they weren't at fault for where the bombs were sent to. That was governmental. But they didn't get a statue until 20 years ago. And why didn't they get a statue? Because it was accepted they were killing a whole load of civilians. They bombed a whole load of civilians. You know, we talk about the 633 Squadron, we say fantastic. You know, that's the ones who blew up the dams. Right? Now, think about it. If you blow dams up, what happens? You drown people. You don't drown soldiers only. You drown men, women and children. That's what you do. It's indiscriminate. And that's the way the bombing campaign was. The Soviets never did that. Fact. Look it up. Fact. They used artillery en masse, absolutely. But artillery can be targeted and was generally targeted. I'm not saying there's a greater degree of some type of lack of cruelty. I'm just saying that's the reality of it. So if you really want to look to what happens in the war and how far you will go, you only need to look at the final end of the Second World War in Japan and the dropping of nuclear bombs. The only country that's ever done it, it's the United States. And the truth of the matter is, the United States didn't drop the nuclear bomb to defeat Japan only. Nothing is ever singular. They dropped the nuclear bomb probably primarily to let the Soviet Union know, who was entering the war against Japan, as was agreed in Yalta, on that specific date, just before the bombs were dropped. They basically dropped them on Japan so the Soviet Union couldn't come in from the east and take parts of Japan, and therefore post-war the United States wouldn't control the Japanese at the end of the war. Right? So geopolitics was playing its role already. Why am I going back into the Second World War? Because this is the same for the Ukraine. Okay? It is exactly the same for the Ukraine. Because within that war, Western Ukrainians, many of them, who don't generally see themselves as Russian but see themselves as Ukrainian, and were part of the Soviet Union because the Soviets had taken the Ukraine when they took over. I mean, Kiev being part of the Russian Empire forever and a day, right? But when the Soviets took over from the old Russian state, basically, what was Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, along with 14 other parts of old Russia, which now are separate states. You know, but they were previously parts of the Russian Empire and then became parts of the Soviet Union. So the Baltic states became parts of the Soviet Union after the First World War. You get also places like Uzbekistan, you get Azerbaijan, you get Georgia, you get Belarus. I can go on and on, but there's 15 Soviet states. Right? Those states were part of the Soviet Union, all of them. Now, the other factor that a lot of people play into, just before I go into what the Western Ukrainians did when the Soviet Union formed Operation Barbarossa, which is the Fall Weiss, Case White, which is the attack into the Soviet Union, the largest attack ever, formed by Germany to take over that area of the Soviet Union. When you look at that, what you've got to consider is that the Western Ukrainians, they'd taken some of Poland into that Western Ukraine, wanted a free Ukraine. generally not part of the Soviet Union. Fact, that is the case for many, and not for all. I should say there were obviously committed communists who didn't want that, but for many, you could potentially even say the majority. So when the Germans came in, some of them, particularly those who'd been fighting on the right wing of that element, people who were neo-Nazi in orientation, the three Ukrainian groups like Stefan Bandera's group, these guys joined up with the Soviets, with the Germans, and attacked the Soviet Union, and actually saw the Nazis coming in as liberators, and joined the Waffen-SS in units like the Galitzin SS, SS Galicia, units like that. And these went around exterminating people. And that's the word I'm going to use. Exterminating people. Exterminating communist Russians. Communist Soviets, not Russians. Keep falling into this word of Russian. Soviets in those days. But generally Russians, because that's the part of the Ukraine they were pushing into Russia. And they used these Ukrainian units, the SS, generally within the Ukraine, which were then Russian individuals who they were murdering. They didn't tend to use them further north or further east. So they were fighting in Russia, in the Russian Soviet. And of course, within the Russian Soviet, you had all different types of Soviet people, even within the Russian Soviet, obviously. So the reality is that when the war started to be lost by the Germans, these Soviet, read for that, Ukrainian SS people, were now enemies of the state of Russia. Now, coming towards the end of the war, we, the United Kingdom, and the Americans already knew in our minds that the Soviet Union would now be the enemy because it was too powerful. Because if it won the war, it would become too powerful. So hence, what we did is we basically allowed a whole host of these Ukrainian SS people who'd killed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, to come into the United Kingdom, to come into the United States, to come to live in Germany, like Stefan Bandera was doing, to emigrate to Australia, to emigrate to Canada, etc., 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 where Britain had sway. And so what you were doing is you were allowing these people, these Nazis, to live there. Now, the ideologies, of course, were passed to their children. But not just that. The OSS first, which was the forerunner to the CIA, which was formed in 1947, and obviously we, the United Kingdom, got our hands dirty as well, allowed these guys, indeed armed and trained these guys, retrained them, to fight in the Ukraine after the Second World War. And it was all the way up to about 1955 before the Soviets got a handle on the Ukraine and were able to defeat it, to defeat these stay-behinds, these Gladio, Operation Gladio fighters, and keep the Ukraine within the Soviet Union. And indeed, they even expanded it because Nikita Khrushchev actually was a Ukrainian who became the leader of the Soviet Union. So what the Soviet Union never was is, in terms of leadership, is a Russian enclave. It never was. Because Stalin was a Georgian, as I say, Khrushchev was a Ukrainian, and various others came from other different parts of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was egalitarian in that sense for all parts of the Soviet Union. So we'd kept this war running, and throughout then, operations were carried out, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, to utilise the anger of Western Ukrainians against the Soviet Union body politic. Yeah, always used. And this was fostered. So when the Soviet Union actually fell, and Baker proclaimed that NATO, and it's a fact, and the papers are very clear, you can see them, they're held in, I think, Columbia University. I might be wrong, so don't quote me on the university, but the papers are held there from the talks. And basically what was said is that the Soviet Union that NATO would not move 1 inch further eastwards when the Soviet Union, the 4+2 talks, agreed with the United States, Great Britain, etc., that there could be a united Germany. Okay, so this is before the fall of the Soviet Union, but the fall of communism, really, in the East. And so what you'd allowed was the Soviets said, okay, Gorbachev, we'll allow for Germany to unite. So East Germany can unite with West Germany, which the Soviets knew they would lose. But the bargain was that they wouldn't move 1 inch into Eastern, past East Germany, if you will, so into Eastern Europe. Now, the interesting thing with that is that, as I said, these papers are in Columbia, and that's Baker saying that were the agreement. Now, I'm going to play you a tape a little bit later with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who, what you should know is, at the fall of the Soviet Union, when it split up into its different little into the 15 different republics, and all the republics then ran themselves, so Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia, etc., right? When they all started running Belarus, when they all started running themselves, Professor Sachs, an American professor, he, as a great economist, went to many of these countries, and actually, with the leaders of these countries, he set in place how the economic system should function. He did it for Poland, Romania, he did it for the Ukraine, he did it for Russia itself. So he was there. And of course, he had the backing of the US State Department to do it. And of course, of the President of the United States. They all wanted to know what was going down. And of course, effectively was an agent, albeit not a signed up, paid up agent, but he was giving, explaining what he was doing to these countries to help them progress into the Western world. And Professor Sachs says that for all the other countries, the United States was happy to help them. But for Russia, the United States simply wanted to take from Russia. It didn't want it to come into the Western system. So the argument wasn't communism, because these were now no longer communists by far. It was Russia was the problem. And he said even recently he spoke to an individual whom he didn't name, but he said was a leader at the time. And that leader of a Western country at the time, not Australian leader, that's it, he was specific. He said it was an Australian Prime Minister he spoke to at the time of the agreement for NATO not to expand 1 inch into former Eastern Europe. And he said, you were aware of that? He said, yes, said the Australian. And he said, and the Australian said to him, I asked Kohl, who at the time was the Bundeskanzler, the German Chancellor, what agreement he'd given to the Russians, what he'd done to the Russians to allow them to say, he said Russians, when actually what he meant was the Soviets, okay, to Gorbachev, to allow them to say that East and West Germany could unite. And he said that Kohl, that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch outside of Germany, of a united Germany. So even though people today say that's not the case, because this is why I give you that history earlier on, it's easy for people to rewrite the history, to whitewash the history and say this never happened. It's easy. And it's important. It's important. It's like Tommy Robinson today going around saying, these people turn up to Britain and come into Britain and have done nothing for Britain. You know, these we hate Islam, done nothing for Britain, right? They just turn up. When Indian losses in the Second World War, fighting for Britain, because of that time, obviously India was part of the British Empire, okay, were 5 times, let's do 450,000, so 500,000, 5 times the losses of Britain's losses. So in other words, 3 million Indians lost their life fighting or dying for Britain when they were civilians through starvation or whatever. Okay? So the reality is, when old Tommy's saying that, he takes not into account one iota of the fact that these Muslims, Hindus, some Christian Indians, Buddhists, were fighting for Britain and dying for Britain. And I'm just giving you the Second World War losses. They died en masse in the First World War as well for Britain in the trenches in Western Europe. They happened to be fighting in the East generally, although they were fighting in Italy as well. Monte Cassino, they were fighting there, the Indian forces. They were fighting in the deserts of North Africa. You know, without the Indian forces, the North Africa campaign wouldn't have gone the way it should have done. So you see, what I'm saying to you again is this forgetfulness, this whitewashing. And indeed, I've watched the Battle of Britain. One of my favourite films as a lad was the Battle of Britain, and you never saw blackface in it. When, you know, a high-level contingent, I mentioned this today just for the fact that one of the guys who fought in the RAF in the Second World War, a Jamaican lad, has just died at 101. And that lad was a gunner in the RAF. Okay? A Jamaican. Now, it's said that the third largest contingent in the RAF were Jamaicans. But did you see a single black face in Battle of Britain movie? No, you didn't, and you wouldn't. So the point I'm saying is, if you skew people's minds, people then begin to think, these folk have done nothing. Okay? And that's what we're doing with Ukraine. And that's why it's important. I'll just give you examples from Britain so you can kind of understand why it becomes important. Okay? So the fact that some of what I'm now going to play you to explain the circumstances of how this Ukrainian situation started, continues to exist, and the dangers for us in the United Kingdom of it existing, you know, go beyond me just saying it. I want you to understand that the United Kingdom aiding the Ukrainians, which I've explained to you as a state which is corrupt, aiding that state to attack Russia proper. By that I mean, not even the places that Russia has won in the war against the Ukraine. And by the way, somebody did say to me, if the Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons, Russia would never have attacked it. True, you're probably 100% right. But why did the Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons? So let's think this through, shall we? So Kazakhstan had nuclear weapons because it was part of the Soviet Union. Belarus had nuclear weapons because it was part of the Soviet Union. Azerbaijan had nuclear weapons because it was part of the Soviet Union. And every other, Uzbekistan had nuclear weapons because it was part of the Soviet Union. Did we want at the end of the Soviet Union for all of those 15 Soviet republics to have nuclear weapons? No, we didn't. So we made it pretty clear that because we couldn't get rid of them all, the Russians would not have allowed it. And when I say Russia, I'm saying Russia now proper, the biggest part of the Soviet Union. So basically, we had to say, all right, all nuclear weapons, indeed Russia said it, all nuclear weapons come into Russia rather than into the other 14 Soviet republics. And we were very happy with that because we didn't want the proliferation outside of Russia. It's exactly the same way as one of the biggest talking points in the agreement, for example, the South African discussions between the white South African regime and Nelson Mandela of Nkandla Sizwe and the ANC was that South Africa had to give up its nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons which were aided and created with the help of the State of Israel. So they were secret nuclear weapons. But the agreement was South Africa must give them up because it didn't want them to fall into the hands of Mandela. Okay? Read for that what you will, but I think you know where I'm going with it. So the point of the matter is that is exactly the same in the Soviet Union. So when people start saying, well, if the Ukraine didn't give up its new weapons, well, yeah, okay. If Uzbekistan didn't give up its nuclear weapons, if Kazakhstan didn't give up its nuclear weapons, if Kazakhstan didn't allow the Russians, post the Soviet Union, to bring some of the technical, biological and chemical weapons from Kazakhstan, which was one of the major areas for making them, back into Russia, right? Did we want Kazakhstan to have biological weapons? No, you didn't. So all these deals were done to put the onus on Russia having these systems. One, because Russia wouldn't have allowed for it not to have nuclear weapons. And two, because the West, read for that in particular, the United States and the United Kingdom, didn't want, and France and Germany, didn't want these other countries to have nuclear weapons or to have biological weapons, to have chemical weapons. Okay? Let's be realistic. So don't just single out the Ukraine. Oh, well, if Ukraine... No, because you've got to single out them all then. You'd have to say all of them had to have nuclear weapons. And overnight, you'd have had a nightmare of 14 new nuclear weapons countries, in addition to Russia. Yeah, some of them with absolute ancient enmities against each other, all nuclear armed. So please don't talk nonsense. Understand the world. So this is what I'm saying. This is how we need to understand how the world functions. And just on that, by the way, finally I'll end my segment, before I play you some information, by saying that imagine if Donald Trump, President Trump, hadn't attacked Iran following Israel. I think the situation in the Ukraine, and for us now in Western Europe, wouldn't have been so dangerous. Let me explain why. What has happened is that people have seen in Russia that the Ukraine was playing around with it. And although they are brother Slavs, and in the beginning there was no massive enmity there between the general Ukrainians and the general Russians, now there is massive enmity between the Western Ukrainians and the general Russians. But President Putin has never shown that enmity because he didn't want that to be part of the system. Because all he was really saying is, and this is what some explanations will be given to you, is that we want to stop Russian people who basically live in eastern Ukraine from being slaughtered, as he put it, attacked, as I could say, and killed. 14,000 had been killed over several years by Ukrainian armies, and the Ukrainian armies had massed on the border regions of eastern Ukraine to attack into eastern Ukraine and then potentially even into Russia. So therefore, that's when the special military operation happened, because that massing was seen, and the Russians massed their troops on the other side of that border. So the reality is, and all this can be seen, satellites, it's all there, it's not me making it up, you can see it, and please do always look stuff up, don't just listen to me, look it up so you can see for yourself. Now you're going to have to look hard because a lot of stuff is hidden, but do look it up. The reality is that when these skirmishes happened, agreements were made in Istanbul, etc., to say, okay, we'll stop the war. And I've said to you before, so I'm not going to go into it again. Angela Merkel and Hollande, the former Chancellor of Germany and Prime Minister of France at the time, said that we made an agreement with the Russians, but actually all we did is played for time so the Ukrainian armies could be built up, so they were capable of fighting the Russians. That's basically what she said. I don't know if that's true from Angela Merkel. And this is why I'm talking to you about Iran as well, because the United States said it attacked Iran because it felt that Israel was going to attack Iran, and because Israel was going to attack Iran, it had to take some action. Now, is that connected to Epstein? Does the United States president have freedom of movement? Or is the United States president caught up in the Epstein problem because an operation run primarily by Mossad with Epstein, had they something on the president of the United States so he doesn't have freedom of movement? It's a big question. And not just the president of the United States, maybe his wife too. So there is a big question there that people need to ask themselves. Why do I bring this up? Because I think with Angela Merkel, it's exactly the same. Nothing to do with Epstein, but what we understand, and we understood already in 2016, when President Obama had to apologise for the National Security Agency basically listening into all telephone calls in Germany, and in particular all telephone calls of German politicians and German citizens. What did the NSA have on Angela Merkel? So hence the United States have on Angela Merkel. What pressure did they bring to bear on her? Yeah, you've got to ask yourself these questions. What information was there that made Merkel, who had previously said we need to get on with the Russians, we need to buy from the Russians, we need to bring Russia into Europe and not have it sitting outside of Europe, and indeed this is positive because otherwise we push the Russians to the Chinese. This is what Merkel said. But she didn't put it in a negative because she never was negative like that. But then all of a sudden she does an about-face, about change, and next minute she's saying, oh, we're arming Ukrainians. Why? You know, is there a question right now about the EU? Is there a question about the German citizen who runs the EU? Is there a question about Merz, the present German Chancellor? What did the NSA know about Merz? You can't listen to people's calls for 10 years and listen to what they're doing and not know anything about them. Now, listen. Don't take this from me again. Look it up. Look up what President Obama had to say because they got caught out. And why did they get caught out? Because Snowden, right, released the information. Manning had information released in cables. Chelsea Manning, if you remember him, a PFC in the American military who had access to top secret information. He provided oodles of top secret information to WikiLeaks. One of them being that William Byrne at the time, in 2008, the ambassador to Moscow, said that there is a massive Russian red line if we try to bring the Ukraine into NATO. They can't accept it. And he said he's been through a lot of the Russian hierarchy, and the Russian hierarchy have all said, from the president down, we cannot accept it. And he hinted, more than hinted, said that this would be a cause for war. He said that in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. Well, no, he didn't say it at the summit. Actually, what he did is before the summit, he sent a cable. And that cable, so a diplomatic cable, so a secret cable going back to Washington, that's one of the cables that was given to WikiLeaks by manning. Now, we know it's true that he said that. We know it's true because they were saying that Manning should be executed for what he did, much of the American leadership, because he was giving away top secret information to WikiLeaks. And that's why they went after Julian Assange, to teach everybody else never to do that again. So you see, so we know this is true, right? So William Burns said this. He would later become the head of the CIA. And he made his warning previously. So, again, we've got this historical aspect where people forget what has gone on. We've got the rewriting of history as time goes on, which they've done, and we spoke about that last week. We've got then the secret elements that people don't know about until they come out and are leaked or whatever with the cables and WikiLeaks. We've got people like Bundeskanzler Merkel saying a year before we should be part with Russia, blah, 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 and about fast. And then we learned that her phone calls have been listened into, etc., etc., etc. And then she actually says we were playing for time to aid the Ukrainians to build up their army, so we could undermine Russia. We've got then the British Prime Minister, known for her very short period in the role, Liz Truss, but we know that she said the war in the Ukraine is not about the Ukraine, it's about degrading Russia. So basically what you have is, you have this situation whereby Russia becomes a bête noire, whereas everybody who previously was either in the Soviet Union, west of Russia, is now part of NATO. When they said that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch outside of a united Germany. And we've got that straight from the horse's mouth from Kohl. Not 1 inch outside of Germany. That was the agreement. But now every country is part of NATO. And so then you wanted the biggest country with 1,000-mile front to be part of NATO. So NATO could have its forces right on the border of Russia. The United States wouldn't accept that. It wouldn't accept people having that, frankly, within the continent of the Americas. Never mind on its border. So the reality is that, you keep pushing this bear, and at some stage it'll bite back. And this is where we are now, which is why I mentioned Iran earlier on. Because the Iranians were pushed, they were attacked, so they could do nothing about it. But they were attacked, and they said, okay, let's go for it. They then started attacking all of those countries that allowed attacks to come into Iran from those countries. All of those countries that had bases of Americans that allowed attacks to come into Iran. All of those countries that had bases that even had our troops in that had assisted the American were attacked. So you see what I'm saying? This is what the Russian people saw. And that's why I've gone a long spiel to get to it, but this is what I'm explaining to you. The Russian people saw it and they thought, hang on, why are we not doing the same with all of these NATO countries that are assisting the Ukraine and have kept the Ukraine in the fight? Because the Ukraine would have ended the war back in 2022 before our then much vaunted Prime Minister, whom for some reason many Brits thought was a good laugh, when he went to the Ukraine, obviously at the behest of Biden as well, and said, I'm the Prime Minister, Kingdom, we will aid you along with the United States, and therefore keep fighting. So this is what Johnson said to them. Keep fighting. Apparently at the time, and it's not apparently because even the Israelis say it at the time, the former Israeli Prime Minister says, the paper was ready to be signed that basically said the war will end. Russia does not want any part of the Ukraine. It just wants for Eastern Ukraine to be able to speak Russian, to be able to have its own schools, to have it, to believe in the Russian Orthodox Church, etc., to get its pensions without being treated as second-class citizens. Because, of course, it became illegal to speak Russian. They were trying to stop the pensions. They were stopping the Russian Orthodox Church, etc., etc., etc. That's what the Ukrainians were doing. And that's straight from the horse's mouth, because that was said directly to me by a Ukrainian when I was in the Ukraine. So I know that is a fact, right? And that's even before the war started. So the point I'm saying is that this was put in place. This was put in place. Okay, ready to be signed. The negotiator said, it's a great deal, let's go with it. The Ukrainian negotiator. Great deal, let's go with it. Okay? And then Boris turns up and says, no. And the rest is history. You know, 1 million, 1.5 million, 1,800,000 Ukrainians are now dead. 100,000, 150,000, 200,000, 250,000 Russians are now dead. You know, those are the figure differentials. Yeah, and nobody knows exact figures, which is why I give you that sort of increasing ladder for both sides, whether it's, as I say, let's take the lowest figures on both. Let's say it's 100,000 Russians and 1 million Ukrainians, which I don't think it is. It's probably more likely 250,000 Russians, maybe 200,000, who knows, and 1.8 million Ukrainians are dead. I'm not talking about injured now. I'm talking about dead, right? Soldiers, because hardly any civilians are dying. Soldiers, okay? And that's what's been happening. But the worst thing is, we are now allowing Storm Shadow to fire into Russia proper. We are now we've given them just recently 120,000 drones of a 250,000 drone package, which has been promised, and they're being fired directly into Russia proper, killing Russian civilians, like these 25, I think it is now, schoolgirls who were killed just the other day. And the Russians are now saying, we now need to, in public that is, we now need to do exactly the same that the Iranians have done. We also need to have pride. And Putin is being outmaneuvered. And my fear is, as I mentioned last week, is that we Britons will pay for it by direct attacks on us in Britain. By blowing up the factories that, example, create these drones. In Britain. By cyber attacks, maybe, in Britain. That cause, mass deaths. You have a cyber attack on the NHS, you'd have mass deaths. Anything that will teach Britain a lesson. But I think it's gone past cyber. I think now that they're considering maybe direct attacks into Britain. Because Britain is the one who's putting its head above the parapet more than anybody else. Okay. Merz in Germany is probably doing it as well, which has made German hatred grow again. And it's not difficult to get German hatred when the Germans killed 27 million Soviets. And actually, rather than us stoking that hatred, what the Soviets and then subsequently the Russians have done is try to limit that hatred. But that hatred back to the Germans is now back to where it was. And that can lead to war. It's a very dangerous thing for the German. The French are at it, albeit that, like the French do, they're a little bit crafty and don't necessarily do everything open. Okay? But we've gone loud. Our Prime Minister's shouting loud, Starmer. Oh, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing the other. Right? We, civilians, will pay for that, potentially. So that's my question. Is the Ukraine worth dying for? Let's give you some more information.
Now, Professor Sachs, thank you very much for your time. Before we get to Iran and the mess and the corner into which Trump has painted himself, how dastardly and geopolitically catastrophic was the Ukrainian attack on a girls' dormitory on a college inside of Russia that killed 25 young women?
Well, Ukraine has been attacking civilian sites, including this school, which is a human tragedy, but also an extraordinarily dangerous provocation. And in response to a number of these attacks on civilian sites, Foreign Minister Lavrov contacted U.S. Secretary of State Rubio and said in very clear terms, Russia is going to escalate in its attacks on operations centers and government centers in Ukraine, including in Kyiv, and that personnel from the West should be aware and should clear out. This was a very direct statement. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't if you do this, then we'll do this. It was a statement of fact of what Russia will do. It means a rather dramatic escalation following a number of very, very serious provocations by the Ukrainian side, including the attack on the school, including massive drone attacks on Moscow, and including using Baltic country airspace to send drones to attack northwest Russia. Ukraine does not have its own break because Ukraine wants an expanded war. It's trying to draw the United States and Europe into an escalation on its side. It is trying to use the United States in the way that Israel uses the United States. Consider the fact that whenever the U.S. tries diplomacy in the Middle East, Israel thwarts it. Israel makes some provocation. Israel intensifies its own bombing. And you say, why would they do that? Well, they do that deliberately to twist the United States out of shape and use the influence that they have in the U.S. To bring the U.S. into a military escalation on Israel's side. Ukraine is doing the same thing. It's extraordinary that we are being pulled into this. It's extraordinary that Europe is taking Ukraine's bait rather than telling the Ukrainians, what the hell are you doing? Stop this before we're all killed. They're telling the Ukrainians, we support you. We're behind you 100%. We're going to help arm you. What they expect to come out of that other than a regional war, I can't imagine. But this is why Ukraine is behaving in such an utterly reckless way.
Is it likely that MI6 provided intel to target the school? And if so, wouldn't the CIA have known about it? And if so, don't the Russians know what intel's agencies were involved in an attack like this?
It is probably the case that in almost all of Ukraine's attacks, the CIA and MI6 play an active role. That's especially true with the missiles that Ukraine uses, the Storm Shadows and others. These absolutely need to be targeted by U.S. or U.S. and British and French personnel. This has been known for years. It seems that despite Trump's claims to want to wind down the war, he may not have real control or decides not to have effective control over the U.S. intelligence agencies in their role in continuing to support and facilitate Ukraine's actions. This, I think, is likely to be the case. When it comes to Britain, Britain, of course, is the number one warmonger of all. Britain still lives in the dreamland of the British Empire, and it wants to escalate at all times. I would advise Britain, why don't you focus on keeping your national health service from collapsing rather than going to war with Russia? But they're not asking me, they're not listening, but that's the advice I would give.
Wow. Last question about Russia and Ukraine. How significant is it that the Russians used an Oreshnik 3 or 4 days ago to level some buildings on the outskirts of Kyiv?
Well, I think Russia is signaling that it's going to destroy the government apparatus in Kyiv if this continues. And maybe it's already reached the point that this is imminent. That is essentially what Foreign Minister Lavrov has said. So the Oreshnik is a powerful hypersonic weapon system. It can do grave damage. This was both a signal and a target together. But what the Russian government has said unequivocally to the United States is that more is coming. I would be very surprised if we don't see some direct attacks in the center of the Ukraine capital, as forewarned by Foreign Minister Lavrov.
Do you think?
So that was Professor Sachs on the Judge Napolitano show. And I played that so you could understand where people of gravitas, like Sachs, who I mentioned previously, had worked for all these governments and was a central player within the US government as well, see the situation going and see in particular the United Kingdom's perspective on this war and how we seem unable to do anything but involve ourselves to the utmost in this war. Just listen to this.
Today's Russian news here in the last number of hours, Sergei Naryshkin, who's the director of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services, said that according to him, the drums of war are now sounding especially loudly on the European continent, and thus a collision with Russia is actively incited by Britain. We have, subsequent to that, Ambassador Polyansky, who was on our show about a week or so ago saying some of these things. He has now escalated some of those. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation published a list of European enterprises that are associated with the production of drones in Ukraine. After that, Polyansky said that Russia has the right to consider such objects as legitimate military targets. And now then there's this warning that everybody, all the diplomats, foreigners need to get out of Kiev because they're going to bring some fire on top of that. What do you make of this situation?
What's going on here has very little to do with the battlefield. It's important to emphasize that. The Ukrainians, with assistance from the West, are increasing the number and the sophistication of attacks on the Russian homeland. And furthermore, you have all this warlike rhetoric in the West to go along with these Western-aided attacks on the Russian homeland. And the Russians have come to the conclusion that they have no sufficient deterrent against the West anymore, or against Ukraine in terms of attacking the Russian homeland, and that something has to be done to rectify this situation. They, in other words, have to reestablish deterrence. And the Russians basically have concluded that the only way that this can be done is to attack targets in Europe. And in effect, you're saying attacking targets in NATO member states. It's the only way to send a clear message and reestablish deterrence. And as Karaganov argues, and it's very important to emphasize that Karaganov's views are shared by many, including in the upper echelons of the Russian elite, you start with conventional weapons. And if that doesn't work, if attacking a European state with conventional weapons doesn't cause deterrence, doesn't cause the Europeans to back off, and doesn't cause the Europeans to tell the Ukrainians to back off, then you use a limited number of nuclear weapons. And you do that not to win the war in any military sense, but you use that to send a powerful signal to the Europeans that you mean business, that you are so serious that you're willing to use nuclear weapons and throw all states out on the slippery slope to oblivion. And you're telling the West that the last chance to avoid going down the slippery slope is for them to cease attacking Russia, to cease helping Ukraine to attack Russia. So that's what's going on here. And the problem is that in the West, most people don't take Russian threats seriously. And they think, people in the West think, and the Ukrainians think, that you can continue to poke the Russians in the eye. And when they complain or say that they're going to take drastic action against you, you can just brush it off. They won't do that. They haven't done it in the past. They won't do it now. So let's just keep poking them in the eye. And Karaganov says, this is what's going on. And what is really going on when you strip away all the layers of the onion is they don't respect the fact that we're a nuclear power. They don't respect the fact that we live in the nuclear age. They don't think we would use nuclear weapons. And we have reached a point where it is probably the case that we have to use nuclear weapons against them on a very limited basis, again, just to send a very clear signal that, number one, we live in a nuclear world, and number two, that we are deadly serious about putting an end to Ukrainian attacks on the Russian homeland that are aided and abetted by European states like Britain and even the United States.
You know, you take a look at here's just a compilation of a number of headlines over the last several months. Germany prepares their country for war against Russia. You have NATO saying, yep, we could be at war with Russia within 3 to 5 years. UK is urging Britain to get ready for a Russian threat. The French generals got upset because they said, yep, we're going to lose children in a fight against Russia. I mean, it's all over the place here. So on the one hand, it seems like they do believe there could be war with Russia. They seem to be prepared for it. But as everything does, nothing is in a vacuum. And so that does have an impact on the likes of Karaganov, the likes of Vladimir Putin and the Russian people. Well, they hear those things and they don't. It seems like that the Russians do believe what they're saying here and that they appear to be acting on it. The question is, and let me take this in 3 phases here, if Russia has now publicly said, we're going to strike Kiev in a way we never have before. So if potentially the next day or 2 or 3 days, something like that, they have some massive strike on command and control, on information and leadership inside of Kiev, which they have not done at any point. Would that be enough to get the attention of the Western Europeans, or do you think that'll just make them madder?
I don't think it'll work. I think that if the Russians are serious about reestablishing deterrence, and here we're talking about deterring the Europeans from helping Ukraine attack Mother Russia, they're going to have to attack targets in places inside of Europe, probably the Baltic states. I think they're going to have to do that. The Russians are going to have to play hardball with the Europeans. Playing hardball with the Ukrainians doesn't matter. The Ukrainians have suffered enormously up to this point, and they managed to hang in the fight, and the Europeans continue to assist them. So I think, even a massive bombing campaign against Kiev won't do the job.
So that's a pretty sobering statement. So you're arguing, or your assessment is that the current batch of European leaders, whether we're talking about Starmer, Merz, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, Mark Rutte, et cetera, that they can't be deterred and they are going to continue helping Ukraine, even if you have a big bombing campaign here, even with this threat that they could strike European capitals or European targets here. Does that imply that you think that these Europeans, they just don't believe that Russia would do outside of Ukraine? How do you assess that?
Well, I actually think, just listening to the European elites and many in the United States as well speak, that they don't fully grasp that we're dealing with a nuclear armed adversary here and that this is an extremely dangerous situation. My sense is, Danny, that during the Cold War, we were much more cautious in talking about a war with Russia, or then the Soviet Union, and we were much more cautious in our behavior during the Cold War than we are now. It's quite remarkable to me the extent to which we are willing to help Ukraine use military force against the Russian homeland. I mean, we're talking here today about the drone campaign that targets infrastructure and civilian sites like this dormitory in Russia. And but that's only part of it. You want to remember, as I've emphasized on the show before, in August of 2024, Ukraine invaded Russia with assistance from the United States and Britain. Just think about that. Ukraine invaded Russia. Unthinkable in the Cold War that we would have aided any ally in an attack on the Soviet Union. And then remember that the Ukrainians attacked the bomber leg of Russia's nuclear triad. Unthinkable during the Cold War. But we felt, we meaning the United States and Britain mainly, but the West more generally, that it was okay for Ukraine to go after one leg of the Russian strategic nuclear triad. I actually found that quite shocking at the time. I still find it quite shocking. And this gets back to Karagonov's point and the point of others in the Russian elite, that the West doesn't believe that Russia has meaningful red lines. The West doesn't respect the fact that we're a nuclear power. They don't understand that they can't or they shouldn't be able to send Ukrainian forces into Kursk in 2024. This is supposed to be unthinkable. And the Russians believe, I think quite correctly, that they didn't make it clear at the time, back in 2024, that what the West and the Ukrainians did was unacceptable. In other words, a lot of people inside of Russia feel that Putin has not put his foot down early enough. And it's about time we put our foot down. And then the question becomes, what does putting your foot down mean? And as you pointed out, it seems that what they're talking about now is bombing Kyiv in ways that they haven't bombed Kyiv in the past. And what they did this past Sunday night is the first step in that direction. My response to you on that issue is, I'm not sure that's enough, Danny. I don't think that will have that much of an effect on how people in the West think. And in fact, you may be right that this is probably going to cost the West to act. Well, if that's the case, the Russians will escalate. And that means they'll attack with conventional weapons a target inside of Europe. And if that doesn't work, they'll escalate again. This is where we're at. We're going up the escalation ladder.
So let's look at phase two of that. let's presume that, yes, Russia hits Kiev. A lot of video, a lot of Zelensky coming out and saying, "Oh my God, please come and help us." And then the Europeans are angry and whatever. So they don't back down. They double down and they send more stuff. And then Russia says, "Okay, we're now going to execute phase two," which they have published this list of enterprises and drone factories, missile factories, et cetera, all throughout from Great Britain all the way across. And they actually make good on that. So now then, and then in concurrence with that, they say, if that doesn't work, the next one is tactical nuclear weapons. Will that finally get the attention of the Western Europe?
I think it will. I mean, the question you have to ask yourself, if Russia uses nuclear weapons, what will the West do? What are you going to do at that point? Because if you retaliate with nuclear weapons of your own, then the Russians are likely to counter retaliate, and you're going up the nuclear escalation ladder, right? One could argue that if the Russians attack with conventional weapons in a European country and say at the same time that if this is not sufficient and you don't understand our red lines, we want you to fully appreciate that we will turn to nuclear weapons next. The idea that you're going to threaten our survival via Ukraine, that you're going to give Ukraine weapons to hit Mother Russia and kill large numbers of Russian civilians is categorically unacceptable. And we are willing to play hardball up to the point where we will use nuclear weapons to cause you to change your behavior. If they do that, then you might not have to use nuclear weapons. But you do not want to underestimate how dangerous this situation is. And by the way, one of the reasons it's so dangerous is that the rhetoric in the West is rhetoric that I think is foolish. I don't think that Russia is a great threat to Europe, period, end of story. But what I think doesn't really matter here. What matters is what the European leaders think. And I believe that you can make a case that the European leaders have convinced themselves that that Russia is the second coming of the Soviet Union or the second coming of the Third Reich, and that we in the West have to do everything possible to deter this monster, and then if deterrence fails, to defeat this monster in a war. That's really the way the European elites are talking. And again, I think there's a good case that could be made that they actually believe their rhetoric. And if they do, and if you listen to what you and I are saying about the Russian position, and then you marry those two things together, it is really getting to be a very scary situation.
So that was Professor John Merzheimer speaking with Colonel Daniel Davis about the situation with the Russians, and in particular the UK's perspective on what's being done. And as you heard Merzheimer say, he believes that the United Kingdom is particularly aggressive against Russia. And of course, you also heard that a list has been provided by the Russian government stating these factories are ones that we may well demolish or will deal with in some way. And some of them sit within England. Right? So the point I'm making is this is how dangerous this situation is. And it seems that our Prime Minister, for the wish of just trying to get a few international plaudits for being a strong Prime Minister, is willing to put all our lives on the line. I'm going to play you some more. I know this is a particularly long edition, but I think that it's important for you to understand how most of the individuals, and these are individuals who've been involved in the military, been involved in government, been involved in geopolitics and assessments throughout their lives. I'm now going to hand you to a colonel who was in the last Trump government as an advisor, military advisor to President Trump in the Defense Secretary of State. This guy, again, is going to give you a position about how dangerous it is and what we're playing with today.
Colonel McGregor, welcome here, my dear friend. Thank you for, as always, accommodating our schedule. Let's start with Ukraine. How morally wrong and militarily disastrous was the Ukrainian drone attack on a female dormitory in a Russian college that killed 25 schoolgirls?
It was despicable and unforgivable and unnecessary, but it's certainly not the first time. And what we've learned over the last several years is that whatever Kiev accuses Moscow of doing that is immoral is usually evidence that they've done something and not the other way around. We can go all the way back to Bucha, as I'm sure you'll remember, when the atrocity there was blamed on the Russians. Russians had nothing to do with it. It was a Ukrainian atrocity. So I think this is nothing new, but it's depressing, and its impact on Russia has been quite profound.
And what do you suspect that Foreign Minister Lavrov said to Secretary of State Rubio when he insisted on speaking with him, even though Secretary Rubio at the time was in India? This was 3 days after this attack.
I think that both President Putin and Secretary Lavrov, individually talking to President Trump about Iran, and then subsequently with Lavrov to Rubio about what happened in Ukraine, are trying to make the same point. You have not taken us seriously. You listen to us, but you don't hear what we say. And what we're telling you now is that we are not going to take this lying down. We're going to respond decisively. And we reserve the right to respond as we see fit against what we think are the sources of the real problem. And the sources for these long-range drone strikes are components that are produced in the West and then shipped into Ukraine, assembled in Ukraine. So I think that's the essence of it. And I think the Russians are trying to emphasize that they're ready to act to end this war in Ukraine on their terms.
Colonel, are those facilities in the West, Great Britain and Germany, fair, moral, lawful targets for the Russian military?
Well, under international law, not that anybody in the United States pays much attention to it, certainly would suggest that if you are providing critical components to a belligerent in a war, then you are a co-belligerent. So I suppose on that basis, they definitely could inflict pain on Western states. Now, the Russians obviously are not interested in widening the war. They have exercised a lot of restraint over the years. Remember, everything that happens involving these long-range drone strikes actually involves us. We've actually sent Rivet Joint and other surveillance aircraft to systematically map out every potential air and missile defense battery, every potential radar site, every potential ammunition storage site, refineries, all the targets of interest to the Ukrainians. And we've provided that information to the Ukrainians. This, in spite of the fact that President Trump has insisted he wants an end to the war and is trying to largely disengage from it. It hasn't happened, which once again reinforces something that President Putin has said repeatedly. He's met many, many American presidents over the years, and he's discovered that while many of them have good intentions, nothing they ever say or do finds a way to be translated into action, that the so-called deep state or the federal bureaucracy or the Congress continue to operate as they will. So I think that's also what's going on right now in Russia. They've said, we've listened to this before, we're not going to put up with it anymore.
Can the Russians justify attacking MI6 and CIA facilities in Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely. In Ukraine, without a doubt, and they have. Let there be no mistake about it. They have actually attacked those places in Ukraine. So that's already happened. They're concerned more right now at this stage about the components the Ukrainians cannot build themselves that are critical to these long-range unmanned system strikes.
So I think it was last weekend the Russians fired off an Oreshnik, maybe for the second or third time. My count may be wrong. And it was aimed at factories on the outskirts of Kyiv. What happens if they unleash Oreshniks on the government buildings in Kyiv?
Well, I'm sure they'll level them. And I think that's coming. I think they put everyone on fair notice. They've announced that any foreign diplomats that are operating in the area should plan to leave as soon as possible. I think that's a pretty clear indication. But I think that's the beginning of something much larger. I think we're finally going to see Russian forces on the ground move more decisively than we've seen in the last couple of years.
I remember about a month or so ago, you saying to me in one of our many communications, you were critical of Chancellor Merz. What are the Germans doing?
Well, that's a great question. You know, what are the Germans doing? I think the Germans are finally getting ready to change the government in Berlin. I think Merz and his friends have gone far enough. Merz's approval ratings make Trump's position in the polls look pretty good right now. He's seen as effectively a shill for BlackRock, a front for international finance that has damaged Germany. He's seen as effectively having betrayed Germany.
So as I said, that was Colonel McGregor, who, again, another influential individual with governmental knowledge and an ex-military officer. What I want to leave you with now is the position of a European professor, Professor Doctorow. And this European professor, Gilbert Doctorow, has lived or spent many years in Russia doing business with Russia. He's a Belgian, and he speaks Russian language fluently, written many, many books about Russia. I could bring in another European who would also give you an understanding who's a military man, but I won't because it's quite complex. And the timings I'm looking at in terms of where we are for this week's episode. But I'm going to leave you with Gilbert Doctorow, but I'm going to leave you with this question as well. What a lot of people are saying in the West is, and I've heard it myself and it's been put to me, is that Russia will not attack Britain or indeed even the Baltic states or Poland or anywhere else, Lithuania or anybody, purely and simply because if they do, Article 5 will be triggered. Well, no, Article 5 is not a triggering that comes automatically. Article 5 is a triggering that can come if you attack one state. The other NATO states should involve themselves in activity, but it then terms if it's correct to do so. So, because you could argue that that could have already existed in Greece example, with when Turkey attacked Greece, both NATO countries. No, NATO did not step in. Right? You could argue that that could have come to the fore in a circumstance with air attacks on various places or attacks on us. NATO didn't involve itself in, example, the terrorist attacks from the IRA, albeit that we did turn around and say that once the terrorist attacks happened in the United States, that NATO would assist and NATO aided in a certain way. So the reality is it's not automatic. But what's more important than it not being automatic is the fact that you need to understand who President Trump is and what President Trump feels. So let's clarify that statement that I've just made to you there. President Trump said very, very, very clearly when assistance wasn't forthcoming to his Iran attack from Britain on this occasion, albeit Britain did provide assistance, but in a covert way, from France initially. It then said it would send out its aircraft carrier, but never got involved really. But definitely people like the Spaniards, the Dutch said they're not involving themselves. It was made very clear from Trump. He said, when we asked for their help, they didn't give it. Don't expect help from us when you need it. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to suggest to you what that means is that the United States won't swap a bomb on London a missile on London, I shall say, an Resnick example on London, fought an Resnick on Los Angeles. I'm suggesting that Trump will say, when I needed your assistance, you weren't there. So you now need our assistance. And for that, read NATO, which is basically 45%. No, yeah, 45% American. And I think when I used to work for the American, I think in terms of various weapon systems, armory, etc., it's 75% Americans. And it might even be 80% when you talk about lift capacity from the Military Airlift Command. So you see what I'm saying is that Trump has his outer already there. Now the Kremlin will have listened to what Trump said. And the Russians who want, like Kadanov example, who want for there to be an action taken against the Western states who are arming the Ukraine and who are attacking Russia, and as frankly, as Mertzheimer said, has aided in the invasion of Russia into Kursk, right? These people turn around and say, now is the time to attack when the West is split. Now is the time for us to put weapons directly into some of these Western nations and say to them, next, as you heard Mertzheimer say, the next thing we do is, because the United States will not come to their aid, or will not come to their aid in any forceful manner. Now, I think, and I'm going to leave you with this because then I'm going to bring you straight into Dr. Gilbert Doctorow. I think that President Putin is extremely risk averse. I think that if he thinks there's a 5% chance of an attack on Russia and all the things that he's built up, he wouldn't want to do an attack into Western Europe. However, and this is what you might hear from Dr. Gilbert, is that now his survival, President Putin's survival, is on the line. President Putin's belief in doing everything totally legalistically and doing everything in a manner to limit expansion of war is now under threat since the Iranian situation and since attacks on Russia proper and since the Russian people have seen that actually some other countries don't stand for it. Read for that, Iran. And I think that he's now being outmaneuvered, and therefore I believe he is not going to be able to withstand an attack from within the Russian parliamentarians and within the Russian, if you will, intelligentsia that suggests that actually action should take place that creates this situation whereby an attack in London, in Berlin, is absolutely possible.
I think in Russia, the reaction has been very clear. It is indignation, it is shock, it is anger, and it has provided a basis for President Putin to change his conduct of the war to what many people have been urging him to do, and to wipe out the government in Kiev. As to Europe, the reaction has been very weak. They have almost ignored that attack. They have raised questions as to whether it wasn't an accident, that the Ukrainians were, as they say, aiming at some military object near the dormitory and accidentally it hit. However, the Russians say that there were 16 waves of drones which hit that dormitory. And therefore, it is not possible to believe that this was an accident. Instead, it was intentional. And intentional with what sense? Of course, to bait the Russians and to try to bring them into some excessive, unjustified, violent action. And at the same time, we note that the Europeans have refused to follow the advice of President Putin and to evacuate the diplomatic establishments in Kiev, whereas the United States is doing precisely that. So it is without question, the Europeans are looking for a war with Russia, which is bizarre because they will be smashed to pieces if they proceed. But that is what they're doing. I was in a debate this morning with the Indian program, WION, which this very question came up, and a very propagandistic professor from either UK or Ireland was saying, the Russians will be violating international law if they assassinate leaders in Ukraine, of course ignoring what has been widely accepted in the world of the Israeli and US decapitation of Iranian leadership, also assassination. But more importantly, as you know very well, the Ukrainians began the assassination again with the attempt on the life of Putin, the drone attack on his residence in Valdai. So the game began. The personalization of the war to destroy the leaders of the other side began by the Ukrainians, backed by MI6 and perhaps by the CIA in their assistance to the drone attack on Valdai. I think that Mr. Putin really has put himself in a position where he cannot avoid this destructive strike. It will be critically damaging to Russia's position of deterrence and position as a global power if he doesn't carry through on his threat.
So what Professor Doctorow was talking about there was the fact that Russia had said that it is going to carry out a mass attack on the capital of the Ukraine, and that Kyiv will be, at least the political areas of Kyiv will be devastated. Now, we will see whether that is actually the case. We will see. But as we heard before, Professor Merzheimer said, if that doesn't happen, then there's a massive problem. And Merzheimer even went as far as to say, even if it does happen, he believes it won't be sufficient to prevent Europeans from continuing providing aid. So this is why I'm going to leave you finally, and I hope you've enjoyed this sort of mismatch, this mosaic of different individuals. And the reason why I've put different individuals on is for you to understand that, this is not just my opinion. I showed you some positive, if you will, Kiev positions last week. I'm now showing you the positions that provide you with a better understanding of the overall position from a position that you won't hear within Western news media. They're not going to tell you about what's going on. Indeed, it's kept very, very quiet in the mainstream media. But for those who don't have access to other elements of media or other individuals who are of great import and of great knowledge, well then, I'm just providing you some of this now. There's a whole host of people I could tell you about that you should listen to. There's a whole host of information that you can read, etc., to get a more rounded view. And I'm hoping to provide you this rounded view. So if and when, and God's sake, I hope it doesn't happen, an attack takes place on a factory making drones in Britain, you will understand why. I leave you with Professor Merzheimer, with Professor Sachs again, this time on the show with another professor who has been studying, frankly, the international affairs within Russia and Eastern Europe for ever and a day. And I hope that you have understood what I've tried to pass to you, and what I believe Professor Vin Diesel is going to explain to you with Professor Merzheimer. and why I've spent this amount of time on this issue.
We are joined today by Professor Jeffrey Sachs to discuss a security situation in Europe, which appears to be becoming more and more dangerous. So thank you very much for coming back on the program. I've been looking with great concern at the possibility of a NATO-Russia war breaking out, because we've always, over the past 4 years, had this incremental escalation, and it now appears to have reached a point where it seems almost impossible for Russia not to retaliate. That is, drones are attacking Russia out of the territory of the Baltic states. First, it was denied by NATO, and now they recognize that it's happening, but they claim that Ukraine doesn't have the right to use their territory, but the fact that they're doing this is Russia's fault anyways. So it's quite incredible stuff, and now they're condemning Russia for threatening to retaliate. So how do you make sense of this situation?
Of course, as has been the case for many years, there is no diplomacy taking place between Europe and Russia. Both sides, therefore, are talking past each other. The Europeans are strident. The European voices in the lead are from the Baltic states and from Poland, which are the most Russophobic parts of Europe. Strangely, Europe gave the voice for the European community, which is 450 million people, over to the Baltic states in the person of their external relations vice president Kaja Kallas, also the commissioner for defense, who is from Latvia, or Lithuania, excuse me. It's very strange. Much of Europe is not of this strident Russophobic view. The Baltics, for lots of reasons, psychological and geographical, are, and they are driving European policy right now to a shocking extent. And unfortunately, the major powers in Europe, especially Germany and France, don't put on the brakes. We have, in the person of Chancellor Merz, the most irresponsible leader of Germany in decades, actually. He is an outright warmonger. He has not shown one scintilla of interest in diplomacy, even contacting his counterpart, President Putin, even having foreign ministers of Germany and Russia meet to discuss the situation. Merz seemed to have determined in his mind that he would base his government's policy on remilitarizing Germany, a not very pleasant prospect, I have to say. And so one of the things that has gone wrong, in addition to the voice of Europe being the voice of 3 Baltic states with the combined population of 6 million people and the most extreme of all Russophobia, is Germany, which I think plays an extraordinarily dangerous and irresponsible role in all of this, because Germany has the most responsibility as not only the largest country of Europe, but also the country that explicitly promised the Soviet Union in 1990 in unambiguous terms that NATO would not enlarge. It was the country that was supposed to be the guarantor of the end of the Ukraine war in 2015 with the Minsk II agreement. It failed on that as well. So Germany has a special burden of responsibility. Of course, history is another matter, but not even going to the history of World War II, but just going to the history of German reunification and afterwards, Germany has cheated repeatedly, and Chancellor Merz acts as if there is no responsibility at all. Then we move to France, which is just bizarre in its foreign policy, I have to say. Maybe Macron's idea, which is not all wrong, but is absolutely peculiar in how it is being carried out, is Europe's strategic autonomy. I have no problem with Europe's strategic autonomy from the United States, but to implement it through warmongering with Russia is quite a dangerous game, completely unnecessary. One could argue for Europe's strategic autonomy on the simple fact that we're 80 years after the end of World War II, and it's time that Europe get on with it. It doesn't need the United States to either be its defender or the determinant of its foreign policy. But Macron seems to think that in order to carry out his idea of strategic autonomy, he has to be a hostile, Russophobic leader as well. Add in Britain to this mix, which is also and always Russophobic and has been since 1840 at least, we have quite a brew, which is no diplomacy, only talk of escalation. Now the actual events of escalation taking place from Ukraine. And let's understand the Ukrainian situation. This is a radical government. It has not anything to do with democracy, obviously. It is a small group that runs the state under martial law that is extraordinarily corrupt, as everybody knows. Either you see it in the villas owned by Ukrainians all over Western Europe, or you see it in the reports of Nabu and many, many other accounts. But you have a dictatorship, corrupt, and extremist. And so this is what is happening right now. And Ukraine is trying to provoke Europe into an expanded war, just like Israel always tries to provoke the United States into joining Israel in an expanded war in the Middle East. Ukraine will do whatever it can to provoke an expanded war. This is Ukraine's tactic, because Ukraine can't fight Russia, but maybe Europe will fight Russia. Maybe if Europe fights Russia, then the United States, they think, will have to fight alongside Europe. I don't know what goes through their minds, but sending drones through the Baltic airspace, if that's what they're doing, and it seems like it is the case, then this is par for the course. They have bombed Russia's nuclear triad, bombing the airplanes sitting on the tarmac as part of the surveillance mechanisms of nuclear arms control. They have taken whatever provocative steps they can. They want a wider war because they think that that's their best chance to win. You combine all of this, Baltic state Russophobia, Europe giving over its foreign policy to the Baltic states, a German leadership which, for the first time since World War II, I would say, is openly calling for remilitarization, which incidentally runs against the 4+2 treaty that was negotiated for German unification, which says precisely that Germany will not remilitarize in the context of a reunified Germany. And the aberrant leadership of France and the UK, and we have a perfect colossal disaster, which makes now the Baltic front line probably the world's most dangerous hotspot, even more than the contact line of the war in Ukraine. The Baltic states are probably the most dangerous place on the whole planet right now. That's saying a lot because we have the war in Iran, We have the war in Palestine. We have the war inside Ukraine. We have the tensions in Taiwan. But I would say the Baltic states are now on the front line because they are screaming for war, for vengeance, for hatred of Russia, and counting on Europe to follow through an active engagement in war.
Well, there's some indications that, either Russia, there were some drones entering the Baltic states from Russia now in what appears, it could be a retaliation. Some arguing that the Russians simply, scrambled Ukrainian drones, so they went in by accident. Others are saying that the Russians brought down and then essentially attacked the Baltics with Ukrainian drones. It's hard to say, it's only the speculation. But anyways, it does appear that the situation escalating, and of course all of this is also fueled by mutual rhetoric now of war, and it's very concerning because in such a war they're talking about, there will be no winners. There will be only mass death, and it doesn't seem to make much sense. So we're now moving to a place, it seems, we're either gonna actually enter war with Russia, whatever the consequences would come from this, or there's time to put an end to this thing. And we're seeing some discussions now in Europe at very slow speed, but nonetheless about restoring possibly diplomacy with Russia. And indeed, of all people, Angela Merkel, she argued that it's time to speak to Russia, and it has been a mistake by the EU not to do this. I mean, it's a bit strange coming after more than 4 years of fighting, and but still, it's quite significant, it seems, because for more than 4 years, the Europeans have been sitting on the sidelines, boycotting all diplomacy and presenting it as some kind of virtue that, we don't speak to the Russians, as if, this is a sign of how good they are. Do you see any potential here? Because so far they're talking about whether they should talk to Russia, and if they can agree, then who should represent them, and if they can agree, then they have to come to agreement what they should actually speak with a common voice. And whenever the 27 EU countries will speak with a common voice, it tends to be the lowest common denominator being aggressive as possible. So probably they will end up asking for Russia's capitulation, or I'm not sure where they're going. But at this point, it seems better if any European leader would just pick up the phone and at least just talk. I don't know. Are you optimistic about at least the efforts to decriminalize diplomacy? I mean, I haven't heard anyone talk about speaking with the other side in a long time. They're not doing it yet, but at least they're discussing the possibility of it.
So that was Professor Glyn Deason and Professor Sachs speaking about the situation. And I just wanted to end with that because that shows you the lack of diplomatic pressure that's been put there, or diplomatic elements that have been utilised during this period. And finally, I'll end with this. As I say, for those who listen to the show will know this, it's never one simple thing. But one thing that is generally always there is follow the money. And the point I'm going to make is, for some people, the continuance of the war in the Ukraine is a gold mine. So if you listen to last week's programme, you will understand that it's a gold mine for the ruling elite in the Ukraine. You'll also understand that it's been a gold mine for various US companies who've been shipping their weapons over to the Ukraine because they have to backfill them then in the United States. And the backfilling of those weapons in the United States, whereas if you sold a weapon for $1 million or shipped it over to the Ukraine, which cost $1 million, for sure, the backfill of the new weapon, which you will put into the American system, will cost you $1.5 million at least, if not $2 million. So everybody is making money in Washington because if you're not part of the system, you are betting on the system. And notice I'm using the word betting. What I mean by this is you're getting shares in it and you're and those shares are bets that they're putting on the war continuing. If you look into Europe, the fact that we say we're moving from 1.5%, 2% of money spent on the military to 5%, again, politicians and the military complex will make oodles of money based on revamping our military infrastructure. Whereas monies that could have been spent on the NHS that probably don't make as much, you throw it into the military and a new set of people are making money, or indeed the same set of people. And the politicians, knowing where that money is going, will themselves be getting shares in these companies. And watch to see what will be happening with some of these ex-prime ministers, ex-presidents. Boris Johnson, look at him. He's making money hand over fist based on the war in the Ukraine. So again, follow the money. And finally, what I'll say is that if you think in following the money anything's going to be done in terms of corruption and people ending up in prison, it ain't going to happen. It's not going to happen. It might happen in the Ukraine because, you know, when you've had 1 million odd people die fighting your war and then some people make money out of it, maybe then somewhere along the line somebody's got to pay a price for it. You know, 1 million, 1 million, 2 million, 8, whatever the figures are of the dead Ukrainian soldiers. But the point is that outside of that, you're not going to find people in Europe, in the United States, frankly, going to prison based on this. It's never going to happen. Because it's just going to be normal business as usual. Oh, yeah, I had some shares in an industrial company, in a military industrial company. Why wouldn't I have? It's a free country, right? So follow the money. And finally, as I said, I'm hoping you can put this mismatch all together and understand where I'm coming from and why I've played you these particular individuals and why I purposefully have gone very heavy on academics, on professors who've been studying this forever and a day, who generally are not anti-British, not anti-US, not in any way anti-Western, not anti-Jewish. You know, Professor Sachs is Jewish, Professor Mertzheimer is Jewish, etc., etc., etc. You know, what they are all looking at, though, is how the everyday person is going to have to pay for this situation, both be it the war in the Ukraine or the war in Iran. And indeed, West Asia. Middle East is a misnomer. It's West Asia and Africa, if it comes into the African area. So I leave you with that, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you have enjoyed this week's programme. Hope you can knit it all together and understand where the knitting's been going. And hopefully you will listen to me again next week, where we'll have a different subject. Or if you want me to continue and do a full programme on President Zelensky himself, I could do that. Up to you. Leave it to you. Give me a shout either way, and we'll see where we go from here. Ladies and gentlemen, all the best, and hope you hear from me again, i.e. subscribe and hear from me again next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.